This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audiences. Interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down but never dumb down complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Srikant Iyer to the show today. Srikant is the Associate Director of Science Alliance at the New York Academy of Sciences. He helps realize the benefits of science and technology for society. He strongly believes that the key driver for innovation is people, and he focuses on building capacity on an individual and organizational level to empower diverse scientists, engineers, medical professionals, and early career researchers to be change makers and strive for inclusive excellence within the STEM ecosystem. Prior to his role there, Srikant worked at Johns Hopkins University at Open Chemistry Collaboration for Diversity and Equity, OXIDE, and developed equitable best practices for hiring and retention of academic faculty to increase faculty diversity and promote inclusion within academia. Srikant received his Ph.D. in chemistry and chemical biology at Cornell University and was a postdoctoral fellow at Georgia Institute of Technology, where he worked in the interdisciplinary field of biomedical, material science, and nanoscience, which resulted in a patent and multiple scientific publications. That's so cool. Really cool, Srikant. We'll talk about that in a moment. He's an amateur Olympic lifter, strives to be a better spouse, and is being taught by his 2.5-year-old about being an effective parent. I could just say, yes, there's so much we can learn directly from the little ones. So thank you for being here, Srikant. It's wonderful to have you. We have so much to talk about, and it's just great to have a chance to have you on the show.
Mark, thank you so much for this opportunity. And it's exciting to just have a chance to continue having a conversation with you. It's always fun talking with you. We've been working together for over a year now, almost a year and a half. And I get to learn so much from all the cool stuff you do. I'm excited to be part of this platform and to be chatting with you.
Feelings definitely mutual. So let's get into this, Srikant. One of the things I'd love for you to start with is your grad school to career transition. In your bio, I talked about some of the really impressive and high impact things you did within academia. And then you decided that you wanted to make the transition outside and to work in a different area. It's one that many people are facing, listeners are thinking about, or maybe have done. And so I really think that your experience could be very illuminating and educational and important for folks who are either in this process now or thinking about it in the future. Can you talk a bit about your grad school to career transition?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in India and I did my high school and undergrad in India before I realized that I really enjoyed doing research. I grew up in a household of academics. My dad's a Ph.D. in biochemistry who went on to create the curriculum for biotechnology in India. My mother, she's a linguist and she spends a lot of time as English language teaching expert. So she runs a lot of workshops. The concept of being an academic was very steeply rooted in my growth. And so for me, it was going and doing a PhD was a no-brainer. And so I moved to the US in 2005. I first did a master's at UNC Charlotte. And as I went through that experience, it really cemented my sort of excitement for doing research. That program focused a lot on, the master's program was very focused in research. So then I went through the iterations of applying for graduate school. I was very fortunate that our department head at UNC Charlotte worked very closely with the graduate coordinator for Cornell at that time. And she was like, I don't have much to talk to him. So how about take that time? Because I know you're applying there. So I had a 15-minute conversation and he was like, hey, why don't you apply to Cornell? And I was first feed into what networking is. And I got into other schools as well. And it's like the environment of Cornell was just something that really attracted me. I was very interested in the world of nanomaterials. Cornell had a really great foundation and from a very basic research and from an applied research perspective as well. So that was something that was really interesting to me because, they were bringing in a lot of the concepts that existed into this evolving space of nanomaterials and nanoscience and nanotechnology. So that got me there. And then I had the opportunity again at Cornell to identify who are the different advisors that I'm interested in working. As I went through that iteration, I had planned out as these are the different people I want to talk to, learn more about in their research and all of that. And I was really fortunate to even have the experience of going beyond chemistry and chemical biology department. So I ended up doing my PhD at material science and in the material science department. And that was really wonderful because I was on the intersection of biomedical research, biological sciences, materials research, and it just opened up my view of looking at things from a systems perspective. And that is really interesting because I feel like I really enjoyed sort of digging deep in that complexities of things and trying to piece together, okay, where does this fit? Where did that fit? What concepts fit where? It really guided me in that direction. And during my whole sort of graduate school, I went through a lot of ups and downs as well. So there were a lot of hypotheses that I generated, which did not work. And I went through the whole back and forth, the internal dialogue of, am I good enough? Is this experiment not working because I'm not thinking this through? Or it's like, are some things just beyond my control? And you just have to step out of your comfort zone and you can't plan for everything. And so those were very formative sort of stages for me in terms of, experiencing what long-term research means. Really learned a lot from so many people. It's like that was something that was really valuable that I found. I really enjoyed a collaborative environment. It's like interacting with different people. And as I went through that experience, I also recognized that I really enjoyed doing a lot of communication of science, where I translated my research into an 8-week-long curriculum for high school students. And back then, I wish I had spent a little more time and created a whole assessment piece for that too, so that I could have gotten a good sense of how effective that curriculum was. But there's a lot of, in hindsight, I wish I'd done this. But in the moment, it's like I was so emotionally driven by it. And those were some of the things that I was learning a lot about myself, of just like how I was emotionally being attracted to communicating a lot of my research, meeting different individuals who came from very different backgrounds, and it's like working with them. I was also fortunate that my supervisor gave me the opportunity to volunteer at the Cornell Prison Program, where I was a teaching assistant for a course on philosophy. This is ancient Greek philosophy. I didn't know anything about it. This experience being the TA for 2 senior graduate students who were running that course was a whole different ballgame. And I have to say, the folks who were in prison were probably the best students that we ever saw because they were so curious. For unfortunate reasons that got them into prison, but it was really interesting working in that small bubble and vacuum to notice their curiosity of wanting to learn. And so those were really valuable experiences for me, which made me think I really enjoy outreach. I really like communicating things. Yes, and it gave me this guidance of just wanting to have that bigger impact. But being an immigrant, I had to work within the boundaries of the immigration rules. I was on a visa. While I really enjoyed research, I was also looking to recognize that there's a lot of other factors that play into it. And how do I separate the things that are in my control and what's not in my control, do the best and position myself where opportunities, when they arise, I'm the suitable candidate. So I started to expand my own skill set and started to move in different direction. I also reached that sort of focal point in my PhD program of, it's like, okay, I want to do a postdoc. And what would that be? I had a chance to either continue my own research in another organization or move into doing cell biology. So that's what got me to Georgia Tech.
Mm.
So I was there. And as I was going through that, I quickly realized that there were a lot of other aspects of myself that I was really enjoying. And I think pursuing the faculty route would have meant that I'd have to fit into a certain mold. And that was something where I was having this internal dilemma of what is it that I, as a scientist, I, as an individual, value. And I started to explore a lot of my identities that were just beyond my scientific identity. How do I communicate, connect with individuals? Engagement became a very important piece for me because I got a lot of satisfaction in terms of one, learning how to engage with people, two, be curious about how effectively I can engage with people, and also learn to evolve as I make some mistakes as I go along. And that sort of adaptive nature was something that I really enjoyed. And it made me realize that I would like to expand my own impact and broaden my own impact, which is what led me to pivot to work in with Oxide, where we did a lot of work in terms of really understanding what are some of the barriers and biases that are really impacting representation of faculty, especially in the chemistry department. And it was like a huge shift for me. And I appreciate Rigoberto Hernandez for valuing the cultural understanding that I came in with all the PhD and the postdoctoral experience that I had. And also my colleague, Dontari Stallings, who worked very closely with me in terms of getting me up to speed in terms of what are some of the nuances that exist as well. And that was a great learning opportunity for me, which sort of got me to this phase where it's like I realized I really enjoy learning. I'm very curious about what's going on around. And with maturity, I've realized that all of that sort of encompasses with the vulnerability that I share and show. Because I think if I am not open about, hey, I'm not understanding what the purpose of this is or what direction this is going, I struggle hitting a dead end in conversations. And so that's been an interesting space where I think through my various experiences, through situations, I have found ways to sort of enjoy being uncomfortable, learning from that. And that is something that I really value in terms of my own growth.
Yes.
And now that's led me to the New York Academy of Sciences, where I have the opportunity to work with a larger audience who are interested in moving to faculty, who are also interested in moving into different career paths where they can really have the impact. And I think that is something that I am able to really enjoying bringing back of it's like tapping into people's curiosity and learning aspect of them growing.
So many important themes that you've mentioned, Srikant. I just want to highlight a couple and then ask some follow-up questions. One, I think it's fascinating that your mom is a linguist, and language and communication you found as you were exploring was something, as you're both doing research at the bench and you're also exploring these opportunities to engage and have outreach, combining both aspects maybe of your parents in a certain way and then bring it in a new direction as well. You mentioned the curiosity, which I'm a big believer in the importance of that quality. It can lead to so many opportunities. And I want to ask you about a term that's often maligned, I guess people dread, which is networking. And the way you phrase it, you were talking about systems thinking. And it's not really how I have envisioned or heard other people discuss networking. I think it's really important, though, when you have a particular audience that is more familiar with terminology to relate something new or something maybe that is looked at as a must do, but not really something that you like to do, but by relating it to systems thinking. And so I really would like you to maybe expand a little bit on this specific point. Then I have some other questions from your first response that I'd like to also highlight, relating how your curiosity, looking at networking as sort of systems thinking, and how that led to you applying and then having a positive experience up at Cornell.
Yeah, there are levels of complexity it's like that sort of exists when you're looking at things from a systems perspective. A lot of it is we as individuals take a very direct approach of if I do this, the outcome of that is going to be this, right? There's a very linear thought process that sort of goes into it. But we are all working within a small piece of the bigger sort of system that exists. And how all of those sort of systems work and interact, and there is so much flexibility and variability that exists, that sort of goes to a lot of the complexities that really exist. So, for example, it's like when you look at things from the diversity, equity, inclusion angle, something that was really fascinating to me as a graduate student was that there were 40% of women scientists getting their PhDs. And so there was a lot of work that was done at the K through 12, at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level to get that level of representation. But when you look at the faculty representation, that percentage is not conserved. So there's only a 20% representation of women scientists. So a lot of that sort of dives a lot deeper into, it's like, one, what is happening at the individual level? And two, what's happening at the systemic level? Our policies like positioned in such a way where individuals who come from a minority background don't feel that they're part of this system or part of the department or part of the organization. Systems thinking is like it's a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach, and it's such a dynamic system. And I think that is really critical, where I think as scientists, we try our best to work within a controlled environment in order to really understand the depths of how there is a linear correlation or if there is a correlation or not. But when you're looking at it from an organization perspective, there are so many dynamic variabilities going on. And how do you make a small tweak that sort of really impacts the entire system becomes critical.
Yes.
And if you look at it, if you try to boil it down, the influencers within the system are individuals. So how do we bring in a human-centric approach where we get to the value and the interests of the people who represent the organization and how they are able to bring in and the changes within the system becomes a really critical aspect.
Yes, yes. And the thread that I was thinking about too is when you're networking and you having this sort of broader perspective, like there are other people out there beyond my lab, my particular unit, that could influence whether I go here or there or want to pursue this channel that I had absolutely no idea was even there. So this broader perspective, it can be very helpful when you are thinking about networking and relationship building, which is another big theme that scientists often are told should be important, but maybe relating it to, well, if you think about it as a large system, where are the places that you'd like to go and who are the people who are involved in those things? Where are they located or in the real world or online? And how can I figure out how to reach out to those people, just for example?
Yeah, that's great. And thanks for looping back the networking aspect, because when I was at Georgia Tech, I had the chance to join the BEST program, which was a program that was funded by NIH. And that was my first sort of view into, as a scientist, also have the opportunity and options to look at these diverse career paths that exist. And as I was boiling it down, some of the things that were becoming really important was communication skills that were really valuable. Leadership skills of how are you being proactive in terms of guiding a certain conversation. And these were all sort of valuable skills that were coming to my attention, in addition to the strong technical background that I also had. I think that was really critical. And I think when you're talking about networking, so I think networks play such a key role, because by interacting with someone, say, who is in the space of science policy, someone who's in the space of being an entrepreneur, as, for example, a CEO at a startup or a CEO at a larger company, you get to learn a lot about, through their experiences, of what that industry looks like. And then it gives you those sort of brief moments of putting yourself in that position of how I see myself being part of this system. And because we are all part of a system, whether it's in academia or whether it's in any other field. And you brought up something really interesting, that relationship building space. Through my experiences at the BEST program, I was able to expand my own scientific network. And it gave me a sense of testing out some of the networking skills that I didn't have. For example, this is always something that dreaded me. What should go on that subject line for me to get the individual's attention? And as I was looking at different people's profiles, hey, this person is interesting. Why don't I just ask? Your transition into this career is really interesting. Would love to have a chat. And people are open to having that conversation. And that's the other piece. I think, like, when you're looking to network, I think it's really important to approach networking from the angle of wanting to build a relationship and connect with individuals. because that individual is committing to the time and effort that they're putting in. And it shouldn't be a transactional, it's like a conversation all the time, because then both parties lose interest. It becomes a very, hey, I want one, two, three. How do we make that happen? And that is a really interesting aspect that sort of comes out. And I think networking is just, I benefited a lot from networking. When I was at Johns Hopkins, I was looking to transition to New York. And because my wife lived in New York, and we were slowly getting tired of doing the long distance travel. Even though New York and Baltimore is not too far, it's like we had to make a plan. Every weekend, I'm going to be here and then you're going to come. There was something to look forward to. And as I was doing that, I came across the New York Academy of Sciences, and I just did a cold outreach to Alejandro de la Puenta, who was back then the associate director, being like, hey, it's interesting you're doing a lot of these diversity, equity, inclusion sort of conversations. This is my background, and I would love to connect with you when I'm in New York at some point. And that's how we connected. And he heard a lot about my experience of working closely with department heads in terms of doing workshops and taking the role of being a facilitative leader in terms of guiding a lot of these senior scientists who are very proficient and who've made an impact in their career. And those research faculty and those department heads are coming to our workshops because they want to learn how to improve inclusion, how to make equitable decisions. So I shared a lot with him of what are the kind of workshops we ran, what are some of the issues that we talk and what scientists are experiencing. And he was like, hey, I am looking for someone to run a workshop for me, focusing a lot on career transition. Would you be interested? So we spent a couple of months working that out, and I ran a workshop for him. Little did I know that he was looking to transition at that time to another role. And that workshop ended up being like a pre-interview in some sense for me, which, and then as soon as he said that he's going to transition to this next role, he sponsored me. He advocated for me, and he was like, hey, I know someone that I worked very closely with, and I think he would be really valuable to the organization. And that's how the New York Academy of Sciences, and we connected through a network as well. I'm so fortunate that you're bringing in a lot of your experiences in science communication to my audience of the New York Academy of Sciences. And there have been wonderful, impactful work that a lot of people have benefited and worked from taking your course as well. So I would say network it defines your net worth, especially in a professional phase.
So many good nuggets there. And I want to talk about leadership in a moment because you've been such a leader in your role. And I think just for listeners, a couple other strands that I just want to pull a little bit out that you've mentioned as far as the networking part is the curiosity, the exploration aspect of it. And also you did a tremendous number of different activities, whether it was involvement in the BEST program, you talked about creating a curriculum for high school students, the prison, of course, you were TAing for this other course that was offered on philosophy as part of a prison program. And so that kind of exposure, not only were you increasing your network, if you want, you also were learning a lot about yourself and what you were interested in. I know it can be difficult to find time for these types of activities. You clearly were able to max out on those in addition to getting the patent and publishing and doing all those things, which is so impressive. I think that exposing yourself to those new and different things maybe can make the heartache or the difficulty of deciding, oh, what do I want to do? Where do I want to go next? At least it informs it. Transitions are always hard, but maybe it informs it a little bit more because you put yourself in such a diverse set of experiences and learned where some of your passions lie, what you're good at, and that can help direct you to your next step. So really, really helpful. And let's talk about that next step that occurred at the time, which is in your current role at the New York Academy of Sciences. And I'd love for you to share your reflections, your perspectives on leadership in your role now and what that means. And for those who are listening who are interested in taking on leadership roles, what should they be thinking?
It's such a loaded question. And I say that it's such a loaded question because we are in 2022. We are still going through various aspects of the pandemic. And there have been so many different leaders who have emerged during this time. We always view leaders as someone who is in power, but there have been so many people who might not have been in power, but gave themselves the authority to lead and bringing in different things in terms of calling out misinformation that was being shed or refining a lot of the conversations in terms of being more effective. And I think it's so interesting because the pandemic has paralleled sort of my journey as the associate director at the New York Academy of Sciences, because as a scientist, I came in with a lot of assumptions. Some of those were stereotypes that were myths that ended up being busted. For example, there's always this notion that you're born as a leader, whereas the reality and the research shows that you can evolve into being a leader. And there are no defined characteristics of a leader, right? A lot of people can exercise their role as a leader depending on what the situation is. And which just led me to think a lot about the concept of situational leadership, the concept of adaptive leadership. This is where our different identities play a key role. As part of my role at the New York Academy of Sciences is running a program called Science Alliance Leadership Training Program. Who have had Yahaira, who was the creator of this program, as a guest previously. And she was involved in terms of creating this, where she brought in an organization psychologist and an improv director from theater to work very closely with students in terms of having them really work through the different nuances of leadership, just like taking improvisational methods in terms of how to improve their leadership. And I've seen my own growth from that lens as well, where some of the key aspects of leadership is making decisions, the importance of making decisions. How do you influence and motivate others? And at the same time, how do you maintain effective relationships? Maintaining effective relationships can range from how are you transparent with your colleagues? How are you building that trust within your community, within your network? These are the key components of leadership that play along in every individual's life and key aspects that every leader takes upon. It's like, how do you work through all of those things? How do you put yourself in positions where you test out some of these things and get that feedback and improve upon it? Has made me realize that approaching leadership has a lot of parallels of how we approach doing bench research. You define a problem and then you identify, okay, these are the gaps. These are some of the methods or technical skills I'm going to use in order to understand whether this hypothesis works. And from a leadership perspective, like there are so many translatable components and processes that exist. It's like, here is an issue that I'm having within my team. What kind of methods do I use where I really bring in the best out of the individuals who are part of my team? What kind of environment do I cultivate where they feel that I'm able to bring in my full self in terms of innovation? How do you manage conflicts? And, it's like embrace conflicts, because conflicts are a key stepping stone in terms of improving processes, in terms of improving efficiency, in terms of calling out some of the biases that we might have as individuals. And for me, all of those things that boil down to how do I create a learning environment, which is where I try to bring in with a lot of the workshops that I bring, because we cannot have uncomfortable conversations if we don't have that learning environment to give people the opportunity to make mistakes. Be curious about that. Get that effective feedback, which is really important, because giving someone feedback is really critical, and how you give it. Language matters in that sense. That is really critical. Going into understanding what are the stereotypes that exist is really important. It's like in creating and cultivating that learning environment. And then leading to the fact that how do we create concrete processes? So we recognize like these things are black and white. This is sort of the gray area. So if we are working within this gray area of experimentation and testing out, how do we go through that aspect of learning from what outcomes come from that and be part of that learning network? I think the older we get and the more senior roles we come into it, valuing the intelligence of your team becomes so much more important. Individuals are resistant to change if they don't have the clarity of what direction we are going, and if individuals feel like they don't have an onus or they're not able to bring in their experiences to the table, and you're taking away that from them. If you're taking that away from them, it's impacting the way the team works. So how do you keep that? So
Just what wonderful keys. I want to ask you another question about leadership as we start to wrap up, and also let listeners know that we're going to continue this conversation with Srikant in a second episode because there is just so much to unpack, is the often the verb of choice here. Discover, explore, share uncomfortable conversations. And the way you phrase that in such an insightful way by comparing it to bench work. And I really think that can take some of the sting or some of the reluctance out of having uncomfortable kinds of situations because nobody really enjoys these. But one of the things you were talking about when you were talking about how to really address uncomfortable situations, first of all, your point that you need to have those to really move forward and starting with that. And then the question is, okay, but nobody wants to have them. So how do you do it? And relating it to experimentation and also saying, well, to get started, we can explore some of the biases that we are entering into this conversation with, and starting there and talking about some of these process related issues that will be very familiar to scientists because they are probably applying them or trying to understand them as they enter into an experiment or a test or whatever the next activity that they're doing is. But if you could talk a little bit about that process, because I really think it would be so helpful for anyone who is interested in leading. And again, you talked about situational leadership, leading a team, or even maybe even just leading an important discussion. All elements of what you mentioned are just critical for doing it in a way that can produce, I think, the best result.
Now, Mark, that's a really great question. And I think something that I have learned and complementing it with evidence that out there is the importance of bringing the concept of growth mindset approach and psychological safety. Growth mindset approach is really important because, as we said, there are a lot of problems that are not well defined. As scientists, our first approach is to find a solution for a problem. But a lot of the times those problems are well defined. So there's a more sort of the logic sort of kicks in. It's like where I can logically follow this. But in a growth mindset approach, it's like we're opening up a certain difficult topic. What are the different aspects that sort of, so having an open mind of, okay, let's just have a bigger discussion, a brainstorming session of what are the different pieces that exist. Whether that means we create millions of Post-its, have that set up there. It's like have that divergent sort of approach. And then trying to fight, and now that we are rooted in reality, it's like what are some of the structural definitions we need to keep in mind in order to start looking at what are the different ideas that we can bring and converge towards. And this is the aspect of design thinking that is very commonly used. For me, design thinking is really interesting because they have the whole pathway of looking at a problem from the perspective of empathy, ideating it, developing a prototype, and then testing it out. As scientists, we do that too. Like we define a problem, ideate on it, identify sort of the hypothesis. The prototypes end up being our experiments that we do to identify which of these experiments work. And then we look at the output that we get from that. And then we refine our hypothesis or move in that direction. And I think when you're working with people, when you're working with individuals, which is what a leader does, having that empathy perspective is really important because you want to give your team, the participants that you are working with when you're doing a facilitative leadership or facilitating a workshop, give them the space. This is a psychological safe space where we are all here. We're bringing in our vulnerabilities of not knowing a lot of different things, relying on the next person to teach you a certain aspects, which is where the curiosity piece comes in, giving your peers the opportunity to teach you and learn from them, and going in that aspect, that loop, which is so critical, by having this whole larger environment of a growth mindset approach. So because if we go into a certain approach of, okay, we are going to stipulate you, these are the things you're going to do in terms of a fix, which is typically a fixed mindset approach is. And I bring this thought because in 2019, there was a paper that was published where there was the schema of growth mindset versus fixed mindset, where it's like students are born intelligent. So I'm going to teach my course in a certain way. And there was another course where the faculty was using growth mindset approach, where the course was evolving based on the needs of the students. It was a really interesting approach of a student-centric, human-centric approach. And that's what I bring in within my space. And that's what, it's like interestingly tying back to the Science Leadership Training Program, that's what it is. Bringing in the nuances of psychological safety and the growth mindset to have scientists recognize that they don't have to mimic the leaders that they see around them. There are leaders within them. And as they get comfortable by testing out some of their different identities and traversing across different boxes that we put leaders in and testing those boundaries and learning how effective they are and improving on that is a really critical piece. I always talk about, as a leader, we need to be open to learning as well. That's one of my biggest fears. I'm always afraid if I lose the fun aspect of learning, then I'm just going to be robotic and it becomes a little monotonous for me. So I need to constantly challenge myself and move along that way. A lot of that is, part of it is based on evidence that I've read. Part of it is based on my own personal experiences, working with various graduate students and postdocs and learning from them about what their experiences are and bringing all of that into a learning space. And that's what I enjoy with the role. Don't have to forget about what it is to be a scientist, to be curious. I don't need to jump around from labels. I can bring in my own personal comfort and my own personal self into my own personal role as well. And that gives me satisfaction. If I have that satisfaction, I'm able to bring that aspect to the workshops that I run and through the relationships and partners that I'm building.
Wonderful. So many things that can be applied, so many ways of thinking, approaches, perspectives, and specific tactics or specific strategies to think about for listeners. As I mentioned, we're going to have Srikant back for another episode to continue this wonderful dialogue. Srikant Iyer, thank you for sharing just this bit. There was so much packed into our discussion. I know listeners are going to find it highly valuable. I really enjoyed it myself. Your freshness and enlivened these topics in ways that often we don't hear them discussed. So thank you for what you do and for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you will be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.